So I think if you're completely honest with yourself as a cyclist on a long enough timeline, you're going to hit bike burnout. It's this weird thing where this activity that you love, that you adore, that you've spent money on and so much time on, suddenly doesn't seem as appealing, doesn't seem fun, and you don't even want to touch or look at a bike. And it's really weird when it happens, especially if you identify yourself with cycling. And then there's this internal struggle of, imposter syndrome, or did I just waste all this time in this thing that I thought I would do forever, but am now currently not so into. So bike burnout, that is the topic of this video. I'm going to talk about 2 times when I've experienced it and how I'm slowly crawling out of bike burnout again. So like many of you, I'm super stoked on bikes and had a really long extended honeymoon period, as I would say, where nothing would get me so excited as the prospect of a bike ride, looking at new bike parts, riding new bikes. It just seemed like this love affair with this thing on 2 wheels would never end. But then I kind of burnt out on bikes a couple years ago, and to be honest, it was when we were training for what was then called Dirty Kansas 200 and is now Gravel Unbound Gravel presented by Garmin, that race. Up until that point, we had ridden bikes mostly just for funsies, never really kept metrics, didn't ever train or anything. But then we got this wild hair that, doing an event like that is something that we had to do to be a real cyclist. We committed to it. I tried to make it fun for myself by treating it like a creative project. I wanted to film the whole process and the end result, whatever it would be. In the first couple weeks, it was good. It was new. It was novel. We were getting coached. We were looking at our nutrition for the first time. We were changing our diet, losing weight, learning all sorts of new things about ourselves on the bike. But after a certain point, I would say about 2/3 of the way through the whole training experience, I really sort of started to resent the bike. You see, up until that point, the bike for me had always just been purely a vehicle for exploration, for seeing the world, for doing goofy things. And all of a sudden, a switch had turned on and riding the bike felt like homework. There was something about having a plan laid out for weeks and for months that for me kind of took the joy out of it. And I had an inkling that this would have been my reaction prior to going through this whole process, but I wanted to see if I was wrong, and maybe in doing and going through all that, I'd actually discovered that I like that kind of cycling. However, needless to say, by the time event day finally arrived, we rode the event, I wasn't really excited about it. I just wanted to get it over with. And that's kind of a bad attitude going into anything. You guys have seen the series, you guys know the outcome. And for me, I took that failure pretty hard. Here I am, a supposed advocate of riding bikes, doing this big kind of marquee event, not being able to complete it. And I was filled with all these kind of feelings of imposter syndrome. And it was in that period that I really struggled with my whole identity as a quote unquote cyclist. What was I even that? Could I even call myself that if I didn't like that kind of riding? That's when my relationship with my bicycle really soured. I used to look at it as a, just a fun machine, but then just looking at a bike kind of brought back the trauma of riding all through winter and not completing the event. And it was more an albatross around my neck than something for fun. It was during that rocky part of my relationship with the bike where the idea of party pace started to kind of percolate. I was really frustrated with the fact that, doing an event or training was the only celebrated form of cycling that you would see in bike media, that you would see by bike brands. Surely there had to be an alternative. Because in my head, I love bikes just as much as those pro athletes that always get bandied about, but I always felt less than. It was as if the only measuring stick, the only metric for being a true cyclist was doing these events, and that just didn't seem right to me. And it was a whole process of thinking through of what an alternative form of cycling would look like, coming up with party pace. It really pulled me out of that first time I got really burnt out on bikes. So that was the first time. The second time I got burnt out on bikes was last year. And it had to do with bikes, but also the YouTube channel. I was so close to hitting this goal of 100,000 subscribers, which I'd had for a number of years, that I figured that if I put all my creative energy and my force of will I could make it to 100,000 within that year. So I made about 200 videos, about 3 point whatever videos a week for 52 weeks. And in my head, I was treating hitting that goal as sort of the creative equivalent of completing DK. I know that I might not have the physical endurance, but gosh darn it, I had creative endurance and I was going to prove it. So basically, I nearly broke myself creatively. I think I overdrew from my creative well a little bit. And by the end of last year, lots of things happened. There was COVID. Laura got diagnosed with cancer, and that put into sharp relief what was more important in my life. The thing about being a bike YouTuber, I know this seems kind of strange, that's once again changed my relationship to the bike. Whereas it used to be just a vehicle for fun, escape. When I look at the bike, I see work that I have to do. It's so similar in some ways to my reaction when we were training for the gravel event, but this time I tied the bicycle to creative work that paid the bills, that pays the rent, that keeps the lights on, all this stuff. So you can see where this is going. I couldn't just go on a bike ride without feeling guilty if I didn't try to turn it into content or try to incorporate some kind of review thing or capture B-roll. And it's felt like work again, which is, a terrible thing when it's supposed to feel like fun. So I'm happy to say I am slowly working my way out of this second bike burnout, and I thought I would share the process of how I'm doing that. First thing I did was really just go back to basics and question why it is, I started riding bikes in the first place and what pleasure it gave me. And it really boils down to three things. One, the bike has always been a tool for exploration of the outside world for me. So seeing beautiful scenery, riding by a river, that real sensory experience is what I enjoyed about bike riding. The second thing is that bikes for me can really enrich in other experiences. So that's why I like to combine things like bikes and fishing, bikes and painting, bikes and birding. It's like adding a special sauce to other activities that kind of just livens up the dish, if you will, using food metaphors. And thirdly, there is an aspect of using the bike for self-improvement in terms of fitness. Although I've never been a real metrics freak, I do like to see, some improvement gain. Am I climbing a hill faster? Can I ride the same stretch with my heart rate a lot lower? While not as big as the two other reasons, still important. And so the first phase of myself getting out of bike burnout is, kind of a honest reckoning with the reasons why I actually like to ride and focus on those. The second part, I know this is going to sound strange, was to build in the habit of riding a bike every day. That's kind of one of the funny things about living here in Missoula is that when we lived in Portland, we pretty much rode year round, but living in Montana, there's this kind of forced winter break. I've tried winter riding, just don't like it. So every spring there is this transitional period of trying to form the habit of riding a bike again. And if you're not prepared mentally or physically or just having things accessible, I end up not riding. I'd rather opt to go running instead. I read a couple books recently on habit forming, which I found really helpful in order to get back into cycling. One book is about the concept of Kaizen, again, small steps to make big change, and this other book called Tiny Habits. In the Tiny Habits book, the author states that, in order to form a new habit, you have to do a couple things. One is to set really small goals, like minuscule goals, so you don't fail. And the idea behind that is that if you set too big of a goal, it sets out the alarm bells in your brain, and then you kind of stiffen up and can't act. But if you set a really small, easy, achievable goal, flies under the radar and doesn't set off the alarm bells, and it brings you that much closer to forming that habit. Another concept in the Tiny Habits book is this tension between ability and motivation. The idea being that if you want to form a habit that takes a lot of motivation, you want to make it very easy to do. So in terms of bicycling, the way I did this, you've probably heard this advice before, is to lay out all your clothes the night before. I also gather all my bike tools in one little tidy package so I can move it from bike to bike pretty easily without having to scramble between 3 different rooms, although I still on occasion do that. But the idea being that you want to make the process of getting on your bike as easy and painless as possible. Another concept in that book is to make your initial goals as small as possible, like absurdly small. So small that it feels really silly not to complete it. So that could be just putting on your shoes and hopping on your bike and bringing it outside and going around the block and seeing where that takes you. I know on recent days when I've been less motivated, I'll promise myself, all you have to do is, get ready to go for a ride, spin around the block. And usually by the time I make it around the block, I feel more motivated already and go on my ride. But if I had set that big goal of, I got to ride 30 miles today, I probably wouldn't get out the door. But by having a very small goal of just, let's go outside, spin the legs for, 5-10 minutes and see where it takes us, I find myself more successful in going on longer daily rides. Finally, the last thing I'm applying, and this probably makes more sense if you're a bike YouTuber or combine an activity with some kind of paid creative outlet. So when I go out on a ride now, I'm very clear that this ride is just for me and it's just for fun, versus a ride where I have to make content for the channel. And by making this distinction, I can truly have more fun on the rides that are just for me, and I'm more focused making content on those rides where, they're content rides. I'm still working at it, but so far I've actually ridden, this is gonna sound silly again, 8 days in a row, which seems like not a big deal, but coming out of the winter and getting out of this creative funk, it's been the most days I've ridden a bike consecutively since like last year. I'm also working on a video where I try to climb 1,000 feet every day for 30 days to see what the changes are. So that's another motivation to ride every day. I know that totally blew the small goals thing out of the water, but hey, gotta make that content. So that's how I'm dealing with the bike burnout I've experienced over the last couple of years. But I'm curious, have you guys experienced bike burnout? What was the cause and how did you get out of it? You'd be surprised. I know lots of diehard cyclists that go through this, where this thing that they supposedly love no longer brings them joy, and there's this big identity conflict. And it's hard when, it's a very public identity conflict. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. And if you guys enjoy the channel, as always, be sure to stop at the merch store. We don't have any major sponsors. It's supported 100% by you guys. So check out the shop, join us on Patreon, and as always, keep the supple side down.